What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel Messianic Me TV. For today's video, I have a topic that might make some people upset, but some of you might be like, alright, this is what I've been looking for. But before we go ahead and dig into this video, if you're not yet part of the family, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because in this channel, we talk all things Torah, Halakha, Jewish thought, and more. If you end up enjoying this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up because it really does help the video and the channel. And of course, if you find that this video is share-worthy, make sure you share it with your friends and family. Alright, let's go. As you probably already saw by the title, this video is about the papacy. And although there are many things to say in regards to this topic, I want to focus on a few key factors, but especially on the fatherhood of the Pope. After all, that word Pope, which is the Italian Papa, it actually means father. I'm a Spanish speaker as well, so that to me makes perfect sense, right? That's how we call our dad, Papa or Papa. But in English, it might not make sense because Pope is not really an English term, right? We refer to our dads as fathers or something of that sort, right? So let's go ahead and begin. First of all, where do we get the papacy? A lot of the questions that I've received after telling folks that I am pursuing an Orthodox Catholic lifestyle is, what about the Pope? As a matter of fact, not too long ago, I received a comment of somebody telling me that the Pope is an idol. I guess a good question to begin with is the papacy actually even biblical? To look at this, we have to first look at what most people look at when it comes to the papacy in regards to what we see in the scriptures in the Brit Hadashah, in the New Testament. If we go to the book of Matthew, we will see right there in chapter 16, and I believe it starts around verses probably 15 or so, and then we end at verse 19. Here it tells us the story that we all know, where Yeshua asks his disciples, who do people say I am, right? And then Kepha responds in saying that he is in fact the Messiah, the Son of God. After this, Yeshua tells them that what he had just confessed aren't just his words, but this was given to him, this understanding was given to him by the Ruach HaKodesh, by the Holy Spirit. But then he says something really interesting. Here, this gentleman that Yeshua is talking to, known as Shimon, receives a new name, Kepha. And he says, "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church." Perhaps you hadn't heard this before because you probably heard it in the English, which says, "And I say you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And I understand that when reading it in English, it doesn't really make much sense. However, if you look at it like we just spoke, in the Hebrew or Aramaic, which is the language that Yeshua would have been speaking in at that point, we know that the word that Shimon receives as his name is Kepha, which means rock. And then Yeshua says, "On this Kepha I will build my church." In other words, telling Kepha that he is the foundation. Then later he tells them that he will give him the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and that whatever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever is loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. In my previous video, when we spoke about the priesthood, we explained about how binding and loosing are actually halachic terms that mean to allow something or to forbid it. In other words, to bind means to forbid, and to loose means to allow an action. Then Yeshua says that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen this before and have read it. If you're coming from the Catholic world, then you probably know that this is the establishment of Peter, of Kepha, as the first pope. But if you're coming in from a Protestant background or a Messianic background or a Hebrew roots background, then perhaps to you, that's not what it means at all, and perhaps you have an anti-Catholic argument as to why this does not mean what Catholics believe it means. However, let's look at what the scriptures actually teach us through this from a historical context as we travel back to the book of Yeshayahu in the Tanakh, the book of Isaiah. If we go to the 22nd chapter, we will see the story of the steward of the kingdom called Shevna. And God says that he is going to take Shebna and basically hurl him out of his office, out of his position as a steward in the kingdom, and that he will be replaced by another person named Eliakim or Eliakim. When we look at this, we will see something eerily familiar. We see here that God says that the position, this office, will be given to Eliakim, and that he will be receiving the keys to the kingdom. And also it tells us that the priestly garments that were worn by Shebna will now go to Eliakim. Not only that, that he will be in charge of the flagons, the vessels, and the things that were used by the Levitical priesthood, the Kohanim. He also says something that sounds way too familiar to what Yeshua says to Kepha. He says to him that whatever he opens, no one shall shut, and whatever he shuts, none shall open. And when we compare these two stories, we are able to see the similarities where there is this giving of authority, and that it's not just a kingly role, but also a priestly role. We see this in both of them. To get a sense of what I mean by the priestly side of the matter, check out my previous video called "The Priesthood Still Matters." But if we go back to the Tanakh, to what we see in Yeshayahu 22, we need only look at ancient Jewish writings to understand that this position held by Shebna and later Eliakim was a priestly but also royal office. If we look at the writings of Rashi, who is perhaps one of the greatest of all Jewish sages, we see that he describes to us this scenario, and particularly talking about the keys, as the keys to the temple and the government within the house or kingdom of David. So we see here that this role that is given to Eliakim is, number one, an office, which means it will have successors. And we can see this throughout the book of Kings. But it also tells us that this is a kingly position, a royal position, as well as a priestly position. And this is not just what we see through the Tanakh, but we see this through the writings of ancient Jewish writers. We also see this importance of the keys when we go to the Talmud itself in the section called Taanit 1. There we see this story of when the temple is actually being destroyed and being burnt down, where the priests, the Kohanim, go to the top of the sanctuary, and seeing how unworthy they have been and how they have mismanaged the temple, in their anguish and pain, they pray to God and say that they are sorry basically for not being able to take care of the temple, and they take the keys of the temple and throw them into heaven. And the Talmud records that something like a palm reached out from heaven, grabbed the keys, and took these keys of the temple away from the priest, from the Kohanim. So we see that these keys to the kingdom not only refer to the kingdom itself, but also to the temple. And this is why Yeshua calls the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And this authority comes with so much power that Yeshua himself says that whatever Kepha binds on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever he looses on earth will be loosed in heaven. Another point that I also want to highlight is the fact that Shimon receives the name Kepha. I know there's a lot of debate as to what it means. I've heard in the Protestant world that the word Kepha means a little rock. In other words, Jesus was saying to Kepha, you are a little pebble, but on this rock, myself, the big boulder, that's where I'm gonna establish the church. But if you look at this with a logical lens, it makes no sense. Why would Yeshua go through all the trouble of changing his name from Shimon to Kepha only to say, I'm giving you this name, but it doesn't really mean anything. It's kind of worthless. I'm the real rock, and I am where everything's going to be established. Makes no sense. In addition to that, if we actually look at the languages, particularly the Aramaic that Yeshua would have been speaking, he says, you are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church. But is there anything in the ancient Jewish writings, in the ancient Jewish literature, that would show us more understanding onto this title of this rock? What does it mean? Again, if we go back to the Talmud, we get a better understanding of what this rock was. In Yoma 54b, we are able to learn about this rock called the Even Shetiyah. In other words, the foundation rock. This is the foundation on which the temple rests. As a matter of fact, many rabbis debate about the fact that this is perhaps the same spot from which God created the earth. In other words, when God created the earth, that's from where the rest of the world came from. That's just a little interesting fact. But in addition to that, if we look at the history of the temple, many of you know that in the first temple, like in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies rested the Ark of the Covenant. But you might also know, or you may not know, that in the second temple, the Ark of the Covenant was not there. So when the high priest, the Kohen HaGadol, had to go to the Holy of Holies to offer the Yom Kippur sacrifice, what he would do is sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the Eben Shetiah, on that foundation rock. So this rock is not just a random rock, not a random pebble, but in fact it was viewed as highly important, and it was the foundation of the temple itself. Or as we see through the words of Yeshua, the foundation of the church. And this is essentially the title that Shimon receives, right? He is called by Yeshua the rock, who becomes the foundation for the church. So now we get a little bit of insight as to why Yeshua used the term a rock and gave that as the title and name for Shimon, and he called him Kepha. We also understand the whole role behind binding and loosening, opening and shutting. We see the royal and priestly aspects of this role, and we also see that it is in fact an office, which means that there will be successors to Peter. And this is what we see throughout the Catholic Church. But then comes the last aspect, which is what I wanted to share with you all, which is the title that this steward receives nowadays, Pope. Why is this bishop, the Bishop of Rome, known as a father? Why do they call him Holy Father? First of all, for those of you that hear the word holy and think no human is holy, holy just simply means consecrated, separated for God. And in reality, we're all called to live holy lives, and we are called to be holy, saints, separated for God. But why Father? Again, if we go back to the book of Yeshayahu, chapter 22, we see that Eliakim is given not just all of these amazing titles and roles and abilities, the keys, the robes, and this authority, but he is also called a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and of the house of Yehuda. In other words, he is a Papa, aka a Pope. So we see right here, coming directly from God, that this steward role is also considered a fatherly role. So when the Catholic Church calls the Pope Pope, what it is an acknowledgement of this fatherly role that the bishop receives. And as we know, the characteristics of a father is to provide and protect. But when does Yeshua ask Kepha to provide and protect his people? Well, if we look at the Brit Chadashah, the words of Yeshua to Kepha, we will see this. For example, if we look at the book of Luke, chapter 12, verse 42, we get the hint of Yeshua calling Kepha a steward or a manager. In addition to this, we get the well-known story in the book of Yohanan, the book of John, chapter 21, where in verses 15 through 19, we see that Yeshua is asking Kepha if he loves him. And not only that, but he asks him to feed his sheep, to provide for them, to take care of them, and to feed them. Compiling all of this information, looking at ancient extra-biblical Jewish sources, looking at the Tanakh, throughout the book of Kings, throughout the prophecies that we see in Yeshayahu, and going to the Brit Chadashah, we can identify that this role that the Pope has is not just some invention of the Catholic Church, but it is deeply rooted in Jewish thought, and it is deeply rooted in Scripture. We also see examples of this stewardly role even from the time of Moshe, where of course God is creator, father, and the head of all, but God chooses a man, one man, to be in charge of his people, and this is what Moshe does. And although he ends up having elders or bishops around him, Moshe is the father to the people. He is the one that guides them. He is the one that speaks to the people in behalf of God. And he is also the one that feeds them the the spiritual bread. And in the same sense, the Pope's role now is to do the same. He is to be a priestly but also royal figure. And he is also to be a guide and protector of the faith. We also see that this role is an office. In other words, it will be transmitted from person to person in a succession. Now, practically, there is a very important aspect to this role as well, and that is the unification of the body. Now, when I started looking at the ancient writings of the church fathers and the apostolic fathers, I noticed so many things that changed my views and allowed me to become attracted to the Catholic Church. And many people have asked me, but why not the Orthodox Christian Church? And actually, the majority of it has to do with this, the role of the Pope. Because to me, it is something that I see as completely essential. What happens when we don't have this unification through one leader is the division that we see within the Eastern Orthodox churches. Although it is considered the Eastern Orthodox Church, and though it may sound like a monolith organization, we look carefully to see that there is much division. And not just geographically, but also in terms of doctrines. Many times what you will see is that one church will believe something and the other one will not. And what's going on right now, sadly, that there is this schism happening between certain churches as well within the Eastern Orthodox Church. However, when you have one leader, you can have the doctrine under this person. And this is actually something that we see also in the book of Yeshayahu 22, where the whole honor and glory of the house is fasted upon this peg, which is Eliakim. But don't misunderstand this. This doesn't mean that it is a replacement for God. It's not a replacement for Yeshua. It's an earthly guide to guide the people. We see Moshe play this role. We see that the Nasi, or the prince of all the Sanhedrin courts, has been the same. And we see this right there in the Brit Hadashah, where Yeshua places Kepha as the head of the church. So for me, of course, when I look at this from a Jewish perspective, it makes complete sense to me to understand that God would choose one leader here on earth to be the representative of the kingdom and to be a father to the people. And thus, when I look at the Pope, I see what Yeshua called Kepha, not just to be a rock and foundation, but also to be what we see in Yeshayahu 22, an Av to the inhabitants, a father to the inhabitants, aka the Pope. Alright folks, here goes yet another video filled with so much information, so many opportunities for conversation, and I'm sure you have many questions and comments. If you want to talk about this specific topic, what we have covered today, specifically the role of the Pope as a father and the other things that we covered, leave them in the comment section below. I'd love to see what you all have to say, and if you have questions, I'd love to answer them. Now, because this video is so deep, again, this is another one that would be great to continue in a live stream. So if you would like to continue this conversation in that format, let me know as well in the comment section below. Alright folks, I hope that this video has been a blessing to you, and if it has, make sure you give this video a thumbs up because it really helps the video. I hope you all have a blessed and amazing week. Shalom.